Chapter 8, Lesson 1, The Physical Geography of Brazil. We begin in Chapter 8 on page 238 and page 239. As we move from Central America further south into South America, this will be one of the last chapters that we have that the entire study is on a country itself. You have to see that in the map on page 239 that Brazil is a huge portion of the entire continent of South America, and it's actually, according to It Matters Because on page 240, the fifth largest country in terms of size and population. So we've already studied the United States, broke that down into two specific regions. We studied all of Canada, another major huge country. We studied Mexico, a pretty large country. Here's Brazil, one of the last that we're going to study in isolation or by itself. Most of the other countries we're going to study throughout the world have other countries in the same region that we study in accordance with it. So it'll be kind of unique to see all of what is about Brazil rather than having to compare and contrast anything like we did in the previous chapter in chapter 7. As we begin today, I want to take a look at a reading strategy that asks us to focus on what we're reading to better our comprehension. That strategy is to ask a question that focuses what we're looking for in terms of the answer to that question while we're reading, and then we can actually come back to answer that while we've gone through the content that we're looking to read. So each of these sections has the red heading on top of it, and there's questions that correspond to each of those red headings. Here's an example, just a way in which we'd open up class. What different geographical features can help people earn a living? I want you to think about the way in which geography influences the way people live, and specifically, well, how do certain geographic features help people earn a living? If you think about it, different types of geographic features, such as mountains, landforms, maybe even bodies of water, are attractive destinations for people to go to. If there's a mountainous or rocky area, that might mean that there's different types of tourist activities that can go there. It also might mean there's different types of industries that can happen there. So there's a way in which geographic features can influence why people live where they live in terms of maybe it provides some type of job as a resource in that region, or maybe the climate in that region provides some type of specific crop or economic activity because of that, or maybe it's just because it's something that people want to enjoy in terms of visiting, or they enjoy in terms of living there just because of the plentiful amount of that resource. Second question says, what geographic feature allows people to enjoy recreational activities? If you think about why people travel where they travel, or why tourism happens where it happens, it's because there are things that people want to do when they're there, or there are sites that they want to see. So for specific examples that are in accordance with what we're studying in Brazil, we have the amazing Amazon rainforest that a lot of people want to know about. It's oftentimes an area of the world that is not as much known about because it's so difficult to get to the different parts of the rainforest, but it is an amazing, amazing resource, one of the wonders of the world that we have here to study. Other geographic features that allow people to enjoy recreation are simply the amenities that we've come to know in our world as tropical locations that can be enjoyed and they can be relaxing, or on the other hand, they can be something that people are seeking in terms of a thrill. Now, the reason why I ask you these questions as we focus our study in Brazil is to think a little bit deeper about how geography influences the way people live. Specifically, let's think about how geography influences the way people in Brazil live, and then compare that to your own experiences here in the United States. Let's begin our reading. The Amazon. First, we're going to look at these questions, then we'll read through the section and try to answer those after we've done our reading. The Amazon. How is the Amazon River different from the Mississippi? Here's a picture of the Amazon River, and I also have here a picture of the entire continent of South America. Highlighted here is a physical map of Brazil. Here's the Amazon River that runs in this east to west direction. You can tell that this is actually lowland area over here, and this is highland area here based on the color of the elevation. First difference that I can tell from the Mississippi River, knowing that the Mississippi River runs north and south, is that the Amazon River does not run in that same direction. We know that the Amazon River is actually larger than the Mississippi River as well. It's the largest river in the entire world, just in terms of how much water it carries. And the Mississippi is the largest in North America. How might the Amazon River's size affect the shipping industry in Brazil? If the Mississippi River allows shipping to happen into the interior of the United States, you can probably bet that the Amazon River allows such of that activity as well. A lot of times where there are major rivers, that provides another way, a vehicle of transportation to get into these interior portions of the country. Now let's see if that those questions can be answered a little bit more clearly in our reading. Waterways and landforms. Brazil is the largest country in South America. It occupies about half of the continent. Rolling lowland plains and flat highland plateaus cover most of the country. The Amazon. The Amazon River is one of Brazil's amazing natural features as well as a great natural resource. It begins with high in the Andes of Peru and flows east across the northern Brazil to the Atlantic Ocean. The river is in the western hemisphere, the longest river and the world's second longest after the Nile in Africa. The Amazon is the largest river in terms of the amount of fresh water it carries. It moves more than 10 times the water volume of the Mississippi River. Of all the water that Earth's river empty into the oceans, about 25% comes from the Amazon. Its massive flow pushes fresh water more than 100 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean. The river's depth allows ocean-going ships to travel more than 2,000 miles upstream to unload or to pack up cargo. So let's reframe those questions. How is the Amazon River different from the Mississippi? It's the second largest in terms of longest river in the world, but it is the largest in terms of the amount of water that it carries. It also flows from an eastward to a west to east direction from the Andes Mountains. So from the Andes Mountains here, traveling towards the Atlantic Ocean, going in this direction where the Mississippi River runs in this north to south region. How might the Amazon River size affect the shipping industry? It mentioned that there's so much water in the size of the river is so great that ships and boats can get into 2,000 miles from the coast into the inland or interior of the country. That's going to be huge for the different type of transportation and industry or economic activity that can happen because of this river. The Amazon Basin. What problems might native peoples living in the Amazon Basin have, and how might these problems be resolved? You can tell just by looking at the map that the Amazon is a huge, massive area. If Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world, then you can say that this is a huge, massive area in this Amazon Basin. If there's people that live here, how is it that they are affected by living in such a remote area? Because you're not really near any coast. This massive river is kind of the gateway in and out of this entire region. Let's try and find out. Here we go. One reason the Amazon carries so much water is that it has more than 1,000 tributaries. These smaller rivers feed into the Amazon as it flows from the Andes to the Atlantic Ocean. Several tributaries are more than 1,000 miles long. The area that a river and its tributaries drain is called a basin. The Amazon Basin covers more than 2 million square miles. Nearly half of Brazil's land lies within the vast region. Its wet lowlands cover most of the country's northern and western areas. Much of the Amazon Basin is covered by the world's largest rainforest. A rainforest is a warm woodland that receives a great deal of rain each year. Tall evergreen trees form a canopy or an umbrella-like covering. The Amazon rainforest is called selva. It is the world's richest biological resource. The selva is home to several million kinds of plants, insects, birds, and other animals. Only about 6% of Brazil's population live in the Amazon Basin. Most of the region contains fewer than 2 people per square mile. Some are Native Americans who live in small villages and have little contact with the outside world. What problems might these Native people have that live in the Amazon Basin? There's not a large population, therefore there's not a lot of resources that are going to be expended here, as in there's not a lot of regular amenities that you're going to see when you live closer to a major city. You're living in more of a rural area and a more remote area, being that you're so far away from a lot of what is other civilization. That might be an issue in terms of just your normal everyday type of conveniences. You and I can jump in the car and go to any type of grocery store or clothing store or have those natural conveniences right there, where if you live in a more remote area, and only 6% of Brazil's population lives in the Amazon Basin, there are less than 2 people per square mile. You might be further from any of those types of resources that you and I would normally be used to. How might these problems be resolved? Well, if there are people that are living there and there's better forms of transportation today, maybe there's ways in which those connections can happen between what we would consider the more modernized or civilized world and where these peoples are living in these remote areas. How can there be better connections? How can there be better transportation? And maybe those people don't want to have that. Maybe they like to live in that isolated way, but they assume that risk based on living further from those natural amenities. The Brazilian highlands. What physical features define the western part of the highlands? Now again, to give you a frame of reference, those Brazilian highlands are pictured here. So here's the Amazon Basin. We have the Andes Mountains that are really tall in this area. They're not colored because it's not the country that we're talking about. But the river flows, again, from this westward direction to the east to the Atlantic Ocean. The Brazilian highlands is this western part of Brazil that we're discussing and reading about currently. What physical feature defines this western part of the highlands? South and east of the Amazon basin are the Brazilian highlands. This is mainly a region of rolling hills and an area of high, flat land called plateaus. These highlands are divided into western and eastern parts. The western part of the highlands is largely grassland that is partly covered with shrubs and small trees. Farming and ranching are the major economic activities in this part of the highlands. Farther west is the Mato Grosso Plateau, a flat, sparsely populated area of forest and grassland that extends into Bolivia and Peru. Low mountain ranges form much of the eastern Brazilian highlands, although some peaks rise above 7,000 feet. In other places, highland plateaus plunge to the Atlantic coast, forming escarpments, or steep slopes. These escarpments rising from coast to highland have hindered development of inland areas. Brazil's third largest city, Brasilia, is located in the Brazilian highlands. It was built in the 1950s as Brazil's new capital to encourage settlement in the country's interior. Some 3.5 million people live in and around the city. About 600 miles south of Brasilia, in Sao Paulo, this huge city is located on a plateau at the highlands' eastern edge, just 30 miles from the Atlantic coast. With more than 17 million people, Sao Paulo is the largest city in the southern hemisphere. It also is South America's most important industrial city. Farther south are grassy, treeless plains called pampas. The grass and fertile soil make the pampas one of Brazil's most productive ranching and farming areas. Back to our question, what physical feature defined the western part of the highlands? Well, the western part of the highlands is largely grassland that is partly covered with shrubs and small trees. Farming and ranching are the major economic activities in this part of the highlands. Farther west is the Mato Grosso Plateau, a flat, sparsely populated area of forest and grassland that extends into Bolivia and Peru. So when we're talking about the western area, sorry, I keep clicking the wrong one. Talking about the western area, you're talking in this direction. You've got the Plano de Mato Grosso, and the eastern part of the Brazilian highlands, you've got a lot more of a plateau or higher peaks, as you can tell from this coloration. Here's what some of those Brazilian highlands look like as you go further to that eastward direction. The Atlantic lowlands. Brazil has one of the longest strips of coastal plains in South America, wedged between the Brazilian highlands and the Atlantic Ocean. This narrow plains region, called the Atlantic lowlands, is just 125 miles wide in the north. It becomes even narrow in the southeast. The Atlantic lowlands would be the area that we're describing, that is this green strip right along the coast where the Atlantic and the land meets itself. So this is that tiny little sliver of lowland area where you're going to be in contact with what would be the coastal region, and obviously the resources that come from living in that type of landscape. What might life be like for a Brazilian farmer living in the Mato Grosso Plateau? And how would this lifestyle differ from someone who lives in Rio de Janeiro? Well, if we look at that map again, and if I click on the population as we just read through where these people live, you've got Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, El Salvador. You've got all of these cities that you can see are highly populated in this coastal area. Brasilia was that interior city that we just read about that was built inside the country's borders to promote people moving inland from that initial settlement. So you can see that there's a hard distinguishing population spread in this area, that most people live near the coast, few people live in the Amazon basin. Now when we look back at the physical map, the Plano Mato Grosso is right here, and the population map doesn't show that there's a high population in that area. So people that live in those two parts of Brazil are going to have very different lives. Might be very different for a Brazilian farmer living in the Mato Grosso, very much more rural in forms of not many other people. And you're living in Rio de Janeiro, one of the biggest cities in all of Brazil. You're going to be surrounded by tons and tons of people. Your life's going to be very different with those two distinguishing characteristics. We continue. The rural parts of the region are another important area for farming. Although the coastal lowlands cover only a smaller part of Brazil's territory, most of the nation's people live here. More than 12 million people live in and around Rio de Janeiro, Brazil's second largest city. Rio's beautiful beaches and vibrant lifestyle make Brazil's culture and a tourist center. So somebody living in Mato Grosso Plateau might look a lot like what you see as the picture on the top of page 243. Large open field areas, a lot of farming and ranching that's going on, and the difference between that and the Atlantic lowlands might be what you see on the bottom of page 242. This lively beach and cultural and lifestyle tourist center that is wonderfully positioned in terms of its climate and its resources. It's a great place for not only people to settle and live in the major cities that have developed there, but also for people to travel and visit. Speaking of that climate, the tropical climate. Most of Brazil is located in the tropics. This is the zone along Earth's equator that lies between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Brazil's climate varies. In fact, the huge country has several different climates. Because it's so big, it's got different climates. Let's look at those questions. When does most rainfall occur along the Amazon River? Where do tropical wet dry climates often exist? And what seasons occur in the northern and central Brazilian highlands? If we look back at our map, I'm going to change this over to climate so we can get a different idea as we're reading about the different types of climate. So you can see here this dark pink is tropical rainforest, the lighter pink is tropical savanna, this dark brown is a semi-arid or steppe type climate, and then you've got the different types of green in terms of humid subtropical and marine west coast climate. So because of the different geographic features, you've got different climate features. Let's read about those and try to answer the questions that correspond. Wet rainforest. The area along the equator in northern Brazil has a tropical rainforest climate. In this climate, every day is warm and wet. Daytime temperatures average in the 80s. It feels hotter than this because of the wet rain makes the air humid. Areas along the Amazon River have a tropical rainforest climate. They experience winds called monsoons that bring a huge amount of rain, 120 inches to 140 inches per year. During the monsoon seasons, flooding swells the Amazon River in some places to more than 100 miles wide. These areas also have a dry season when little rain occurs. During the dry season, forest fires are a danger, even in the rainforest. So when does most rainfall occur along the Amazon River? That would be during the monsoon season. They experience winds called monsoons that bring a huge amount of rain, 120 to 140 inches per year. That's a crazy amount that I don't think you and I understand how much it rains in terms of, it rains almost every single day during that wet season. Tropical wet dry climate. Where do these exist? Tropical wet dry climates usually exist along the outer edges of the tropical rainforest climate. Most of the northern and central Brazilian highlands have a tropical wet dry climate. This climate has just two seasons, summer, which is wet, and winter, which is dry. Daily average temperatures change very little. Summers average in the 70 degrees Fahrenheit and winters in the 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But even this slight difference is enough to change wind patterns which affect rainfall. Between 40 and 70 inches of rain fall during the summer months. Winter months get almost no rain. It's important to note that when we're talking about summer and winter, especially in the southern hemisphere, and we look at the different types of climate outside of the rainforest, so here's where we're talking about the different edges of where that climate exists, that tropical wet dry climate. You're experiencing that in the different times of the year that are opposite to us. So when it says summer, that actually is winter for us, and when it says winter, that's summer for us because they're in the northern hemisphere, we're in the northern hemisphere, and they're in the southern hemisphere. So those time periods are different, they're opposites of each other. The dry and temperate climate. The northeastern part of the Brazilian highlands has a semi-arid climate. This region is the hottest and driest part of the country. The daily high temperatures during the summer often reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Frequent and severe droughts have caused many of the region's farms to fail. Even so, the desert-like plant life supports some light ranching. Southeastern Brazil, including Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, is located in the temperate zone, the region between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Antarctic Circle. It has a temperate climate called humid subtropical. It is the same type of climate that the southeastern United States experiences. Temperatures vary according to location and elevation in the part of Brazil. Summers are generally warm and humid, and winters are mild. Rainfall occurs year-round in the southern parts of this climate zone. Snow can actually fall when you get further down to the south and higher up in elevation. What seasons occur in the north and central Brazilian highlands? So it mentioned that you have summers and then you have winters. So the difference between two climates. As you get further south, you actually move closer to the equator, so you get into what it would be a temperate zone. So as you get further south, there's actually more difference in terms of the seasons that you're going to have. In this northern area, you're going to have just those main two. Either warm and wet monsoon season or a warm and relatively wet season versus a dry season in the wintertime. Okay, so a difference in elevation that affects your climate and a difference in location from the equator that affects your climate as well. Natural resources. Brazil has some of the world's most plentiful natural resources. Many of the resources have been developed for years, especially in the south and southeast. Recent transportation improvements have made the resources in Brazil's vast interior available to its growing industries and population. Agriculture, mining, and forestry have been important for centuries. The natural riches of Brazil attract European settlers to the region. They found abundant trees, rich mineral resources, and fertile farmland. How might agriculture, mining, and forestry adversely affect Brazil's environment. So because it has so many natural resources, how do you use those resources and how does that influence the environment? If you are overusing them, is that a negative effect? If you're underusing them, is that a negative effect? Or is there some type of balance that we need to have as we're stewards of this world? Second question says, what are some of the positive effects of developing Brazil's natural resources? So it's got a rich abundance of natural resources. What might be beneficial to actually using and harvesting some of these resources? Abundant forests. Forests cover about 60% of Brazil. Accounting for about 7% of the world's timber resources, most of the forests in the northeast and south were cleared long ago. Heavy logging continues in the Atlantic lowlands. Logging in the Amazon basin is increasing as more roads are built and settlements grow. The rainforest mahogany and other hardwoods are highly desirable for making furniture. The rainforest is also a source of natural rubber, nuts, and medical plants. Logging and mining are other developments have become a major environmental issue. However, the rate of deforestation or clearing land of forest trees has declined in recent years. So how might agriculture, mining, and forestry adversely affect Brazil's environment? In the form of agriculture, if this is a place where the rainforest naturally exists, in order to turn it into a place where you can have agriculture, you've got to cut down the trees. So that's deforestation, both in the form of agriculture and the forestry industry. Forestry industry in terms of cutting down all the trees versus cutting down some and then having a selection that you cut down in a kind of cyclical pattern. Mining obviously tears up the ground and can cause different types of issues. Let's read about that in the form of minerals on page 246. Brazil has rich mineral resources that are only partly developed. They include iron ore, tin, copper, bauxite, gold, and manganese. At one time, most mining was done in the Brazilian highlands. Recently, major deposits of minerals have been found in the Amazon basin. The new deposits might make Brazil the world's largest producer of many of the minerals. Brazil also has huge potential reserves of petroleum and natural gas deep under the ocean floor off its coast. Getting to the oil is a challenge, however. So, what are some of the positive effects of developing Brazil's natural resources? Well, you could have a thriving economy if you're able to do these things correctly. How can you harvest the rainforest? How can you get to the mining? And how can you have productive farmland in what is generally a appropriate climate for those type of things? How can you do that appropriately without hurting the environment? Because all three of these, agriculture, mining, and forestry, can have bad effects on Brazil's environment. Those abundant rainforests, how has logging affected rainforests? You've probably heard from years and years of study of deforestation. A lot of times, here's what that looks like. Here's this plentiful rainforest, abundant wildlife, and obviously the trees themselves having the most value are simply cut down. And then a lot of times this might be burnt in order to clear this for either future growth or to clear it completely for future development and agriculture. Now, the people in Brazil have a extensive set of satellites that are actually dedicated to watching the rainforest, and they're able to go out and police this type of activity, and they want to manage this for future generations so that the rainforest is an abundant resource both for what it means to the environment and also what it means to the forestry industry. They can cut down some trees and produce some of what the world desires in terms of the mahogany and those different types of trees, but you have to do it at a certain rate that doesn't destroy the land like you see here. Productive farmland. Brazil is the world's largest producer of coffee, sugarcane, and tropical fruits. The country also produces great amounts of soybeans, corn, and cotton. Brazilian farmers produce most of their country's food supply. Agriculture is also important in trade, accounting for more than one-third of Brazil's exports. It is a leading exporter of coffee, oranges, soybeans, and cassava. Cassava is used to make tapioca, if you've ever had tapioca pudding. Our major crops. How are some of Brazil's products important to you? Do you enjoy any of these things that are grown and produced or exported from Brazil? Production of coffee throughout the world was estimated and set at an all-time high in 2012 and 2013, up to 10 million bags from the previous year. Brazil and Vietnam accounted for most of this increase. The eastern Brazilian highlands and the Atlantic lowlands are the main coffee-growing areas. Coffee has once Brazil's main export. Today, soybeans provide more income for the country. China is increasing its soybean imports, mostly for animal feed, and much of it comes from Brazil. Most soybeans are grown in the south, but they are important crops in the Brazilian highlands too. Farming also has become easier in the highlands as farmers have begun using tractors and fertilizer to work the savanna soils. Brazil grows one-third of the world's oranges, making it the world's leading supplier of the citrus fruit. Brazil is also the largest beef exporter in the world. Most of the country's grazing land is in the south and southeast. In a recent year, Brazil's sugarcane production was more than 2.5 times that of India, the second leading producer. Brazilian sugarcane is used to make ethanol, which is mixed with gasoline and used as fuel for cars and trucks. For many years, the government has required cars to use ethanol. The country's car manufacturers make flexible fuel vehicles that can use fuel with high levels of ethanol. Some of those important products, if you like oranges, if you like coffee, like Mr. Shane, some of those things are coming from Brazil as they are major producers of a lot of these different major crops in this part of the world. Thanks for reading along with me and using that reading strategy to focus our reading. If you ask a question before you're going into your reading, you know what to look for in terms of what you're trying to comprehend. Then you can actually use that as a check to say, well, did I understand what I was reading, when you've gone through to make sure that you have an answer to that question. Now we're going to apply this skill, and the reason why I didn't do this while we were going, because I'd like you to do this portion on your own. You've already done the reading while following along in this video. Now you're going to go ahead and answer questions in the form that they come in our guiding reading activity. You've got Lesson 1, Physical Geography of Brazil. Our essential question, how does geography influence the way people live? Our kind of big thought process. And now you've got the different sections that we just read through. In the first section, waterways and landforms, you're going to maybe reread the section and answer the following questions about the waterways and landforms of Brazil. For example, number 1, where does the Amazon River begin and where does it end? I would look at the beginning section where it talked about the Amazon and the Amazon Basin to answer that. In which way is the Amazon the largest river in the world? Maybe not in length, but in terms of the amount of water that it carries, right? What is the Amazon Basin? You need to refer back to the map that I showed you. You can look here. In the physical map portion, it shows that Amazon Basin. This lowland area coming from the highland that has the river running through it, and all of those major tributary rivers that add water to the Amazon River. Number 4, what kind of landforms are found in the Brazilian highlands? Number 5, in what area of Brazil do most people live? All those questions were answered by the beginning portions of this video. You can go back and look at that to make sure you've got those answered in complete sentences. In the second section, it asks you to use your textbook to complete the chart with information on the climate in different parts of Brazil. Sample answers are provided in the first row of the chart. So the area, the climate type, and then a description. You'll notice that you're looking at the climate types. That was in reference to our map again, and the different types of climates that were depicted here and also read about in the climates section. Lastly, after you've filled in that information, you're going to go to the natural resource section and fill in the blanks for each of these numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Appropriately fill in the blank with the term from your textbook and from your reading. God's blessings.